Hello, everyone. Today we'll delve once again into the subject of Spinoza, which we've previously discussed in a previous video. On that occasion, we introduced his thoughts through the themes of free will and determinism, topics often chosen to explore his philosophy. This time, we'll delve deeper into some ideas that we only briefly touched upon before. As a reminder, Spinoza is a philosopher of Portuguese origin and Jewish descent who lived in the 17th century in the Netherlands. His conception of God, distant from traditional monotheistic views, led to his excommunication in 1656. Spinoza even chose to publish some of his works, such as the Theologico Political Treatise, under a pseudonym, aware that his ideas could cause him harm if published openly. In this session, we'll focus on Spinoza's disagreements with the classical conception of God. Spinoza rejects the idea of a God with will and intentions, as if God had human attributes. This anthropomorphism of God is one of the central points that Spinoza criticizes. Let's revisit his conception of free will, an excellent starting point to access his philosophy, but also a subject that deserves a deeper exploration than what we could offer previously. Join me as we delve deeper into Spinoza's complex and fascinating thought. In his analysis, Spinoza criticizes the anthropomorphic way in which we envision God, attributing to this supposed perfect and infinite entity feelings and desires that are actually distinctly human. These attributions are evident in biblical descriptions where God is often portrayed as vengeful, wrathful, and merciless, traits that, according to Spinoza, cannot belong to a perfect being. Spinoza goes as far as to turn the famous assertion that God created man in his own image to criticize humanity for in turn shaping God in its image, limited and imperfect. He argues that this reductionist view is not only incorrect, but also symptomatic of our tendency to project our own limitations onto concepts that should transcend our finite human attributes. He emphasizes that the idea of a God with desires, for example, is inconsistent with the nature of a perfect being. Desire implies a lack, an absence, as illustrated in Plato's myth of the androgynous, where desire arises from separation and the quest to reunite with another missing part. If God is perfect and infinite, he cannot be subject to such lack. According to Spinoza, the traditional conception of God is erroneous because it attributes to God human characteristics of finitude and imperfection, whereas God, as a perfect and infinite being, should be devoid of such characteristics. In his exploration of the notion of desire and will in God, Spinoza questions the idea that God could have desires or wills similar to those of human beings. For him, if God is a perfect and infinite being, he cannot have lacks or unsatisfied needs. Human curiosity, for example, leads to a search for knowledge to fill a void, and the acquisition of this knowledge constitutes a form of intellectual union with the object of curiosity. Similarly, sexual desire aims at reunification with the other, symbolizing the filling of a lack. However, applying this logic to God is problematic for Spinoza. He argues that there is nothing outside of God that could evoke any desire in him, as God contains everything and is in everything. To suggest that God has desires would imply that he is not complete in himself, which contradicts the idea of his perfection. If God is defined by his perfection, then he cannot be animated by desires or wills as human beings are. Spinoza emphasizes that the idea that God created the world by will falsely suggests that something was lacking in God, thus questioning his perfection. Additionally, Spinoza criticizes the attribution of human feelings to God, such as anger or vengeance. He sees these attributions as human projections that reduce God to a human scale, afflicted with imperfections and limitations. This reflects, according to him, an anthropomorphic and reductionist understanding of the divine nature, where God is envisioned in the image of man rather than as a superior and perfect being. Spinoza calls for a revision of our conception of God, freeing it from limited human attributes and recognizing God's undeniable infinity and perfection. This implies abandoning the idea of a God who acts based on human motivations and emotions, and rethinking divinity in absolute terms, beyond human imperfections. Spinoza strongly criticizes the anthropomorphic view of God that attributes human feelings and desires, such as anger or the desire to punish, to him. He argues that these attributions are incompatible with the nature of a perfect and infinite being like God. According to him, God possesses neither affect, nor desire, nor plan, nor will, he simply is. For Spinoza, God expects nothing from humanity, as expectation implies a lack, a dependency, which cannot concern a perfect being. Spinoza is aware that challenging this traditional vision of God may displease religious power, which relies on the fear of a punitive God to influence the behavior of the faithful. This conception of God serves to maintain order and discipline, threatening eternal punishment for those who transgress established norms. Spinoza suggests that understanding God as devoid of feelings and emotional reactions could lead to a relaxation of moral behaviors, or even to anarchy, as the faithful might feel free in their actions without fear of divine retribution. This perspective, according to Spinoza, aims not to reduce religion to a mere tool of domination, but rather to shed light on how religious and political power structures reinforce each other. By supporting that God is beyond human attributes, Spinoza seeks to liberate the conception of God from human limitations and to promote an understanding of divinity more in line with its infinite and perfect nature. He concludes that the traditional conception of God reflects more human needs and desires, respect, submission, recognition, devotion, than the true nature of God. For Spinoza, we project our own qualities and flaws onto God to meet our psychological and social needs, which distorts and falsifies the understanding of what divinity truly is. In traditional conceptions, God is often seen as an external and transcendent being to the world, separate from material reality. However, Spinoza rejects this idea, asserting that God is not a being separate from the world, nor its creator in a traditional sense. He argues that presupposing that God created the world falsely implies that he is outside of it and that he existed before the world, which reinforces an anthropomorphic view of God involving voluntary actions and projects similar to those of humans. Spinoza criticizes this notion, suggesting that God and the world are identical. Everything that exists in the world is an expression or manifestation of God. This perspective opposes the idea that God had a project or intention before creating the world. As for Spinoza, God and nature are not distinct. They are one and the same entity. He does not see God as an architect separate from his creation, but rather as the intrinsic essence of everything that exists. For him, everything, from the most insignificant object to the human being, embodies God. This pantheistic vision, where God or nature encompasses everything, suggests that every element of the world, every manifestation of reality, is a part of God. Spinoza thus deconstructs classical conceptions of God that attribute to this entity human characteristics such as desire, will, and feelings, which would imply lacks or needs incompatible with the idea of divine perfection. By eliminating these anthropomorphic attributes, Spinoza seeks to purify our understanding of God, freeing it from human limitations and bringing it closer to a truer and more comprehensive understanding of divine nature. The expression God or nature implies that God and nature are identical. Spinoza uses this phrase to indicate that everything that exists is God, and that God is nature. For Spinoza, this equation means that God identifies with nature, is not distinct from it, but is fully integrated as the fundamental substance of all reality. To grasp this idea, it is crucial to understand the notion of substance and attributes in Spinoza's philosophy. Substance refers to what constitutes the essence of everything, the underlying principle of existence, often described as what stands beneath everything. It is not a material substance in the chemical sense of the term, but rather what forms the immaterial reality behind everything that is perceptible. Attributes, on the other hand, are properties or qualities of substance. They offer perspectives or ways of considering substance. To illustrate this point, consider the example of a red rose. When you look at it, you perceive it as red. This color is a visual attribute of the rose, which is one way of understanding it among others. If another person, with eyes closed, touches the rose and feels the thorns, they experience another attribute of the same rose, this time tactile. Thus, the rose in all its attributes, visual, tactile, olfactory, reflects various aspects of the same substance. For Spinoza, everything we experience in the world, every aspect, every quality, is a manifestation of God or nature. Just as the rose has several attributes but remains a single entity, every element of the universe is a different expression of the same divine or natural substance. This leads to a pantheistic view where God, or nature, is not distinct from the creations it encompasses, but is intrinsically linked to them, present in every aspect of reality. This perspective eliminates any notion of transcendence, where God would be separate or external to his creation, and challenges traditional anthropomorphic visions of God that attribute to him human desires, wills, or emotions. Let's imagine a red rose with its petals and thorns, and consider different ways to perceive it, depending on the senses used. If one person sees it, they may describe it as a red rose, thus capturing its visual characteristics like color and shape. If another person, with closed eyes, touches the rose, they will identify its texture, the prickly thorns of the stem and the softness of the petals. A third person could be invited to smell the rose and describe its pleasant fragrance. Each of these perceptions, visual, tactile, olfactory, offers a different characterization of the same rose. These different perceptions do not fully define the rose, but reveal specific aspects of it. In philosophy, according to Spinoza, these different perceptions are called attributes. An attribute is a property or quality that describes a particular way of perceiving or considering an object. An attribute does not capture the entirety of the object, but provides an insight based on a specific perspective or sense. For example, the red color of a rose is an attribute that does not grasp other qualities like its fragrance or texture, but is still essential for understanding what a rose is through the sense of sight. In Spinoza's philosophy, these attributes are ways of understanding substance, which is a central concept in his philosophy. Substance, for Spinoza, is that which exists in itself and is conceived by itself. It is somewhat the essence of everything that exists. Attributes are expressions or manifestations of this substance. They do not capture the totality of substance, but they offer different perspectives on how it can be perceived or understood. Thus, to say that a rose is solely red or solely fragrant would be a partial view, as each attribute represents only one aspect of its total essence. This approach helps to understand the complexity of nature and how we interact with it through our different senses. It also illustrates the spinocistic concept that everything we experience is an expression of the same universal substance, interpreted in various ways through its multiple attributes. The fable of the 6 blind men and the elephant illustrates a fundamental idea in Spinoza's philosophy regarding perception and knowledge. Each blind man, by touching a different part of the elephant, believes he understands the whole animal, but actually grasps only an isolated aspect. This story highlights how our limited perceptions can lead to partial or erroneous conclusions about the nature of things. In this tale, each blind man touches a distinct part of the elephant. 1. The first blind man touches the elephant's side and thinks it is a wall. 2. The second blind man touches a tusk and thinks it is a spear. 3. The third blind man touches the trunk and thinks it is a snake. Although each blind man is correct in his partial description, none truly understands what an elephant is. This illustrates Spinoza's concept of the attributes of substance. For Spinoza, God or substance is a perfect and infinite entity manifested through an infinity of attributes, that is, qualities or properties. We, as human beings, due to our finitude, are only capable of perceiving 2 of these infinite attributes. 1, extension, which relates to matter and the physical world. 2, thought, which concerns the spiritual or intellectual aspect. These 2 attributes, extension and thought, constitute the only ways in which we can know and interact with the world. Extension allows us to perceive and interact with the physical dimension of things, while thought enables us to access ideas, concepts, and engage in intellectual reflections. Spinoza argues that everything we conceive in the world is either from the perspective of extension, material, or from the perspective of thought, immaterial. He challenges anyone to try to conceive of another attribute of substance beyond these 2, highlighting our cognitive limitations. Thus, the lesson that Spinoza offers us through this analogy of the blind men and the elephant is that, although we may have true knowledge of aspects of the world, this knowledge is always limited and partial. We are, in a way, always blind, feeling different parts of the elephant, never fully capable of grasping the immensity of the divine totality or reality. In Spinoza's philosophy, there is no strict duality between matter and mind, as in Descartes, who posited 2 independent substances, one material and the other spiritual, leading to a clear distinction between body and mind. For Descartes, the soul was exempt from material laws, an idea that clearly separated the physical aspect from the mental aspect of human existence. Spinoza, on the other hand, rejects this separation and instead proposes a vision of coexistence of attributes within the same substance. This approach eliminates the dichotomy between material and spiritual properties, illustrated by the example of the rose, which is both visually red and soft to the touch. Similarly, asserting that a rose is red does not negate that it may have soft petals. It is about recognizing that these two attributes coexist without contradiction. In Spinoza's view, attributes are different ways of perceiving the same substance, which we call God or nature. He argues that everything that exists is a manifestation of this unique substance. Attributes, according to Spinoza, are not in conflict but complementary and coexist without mutually excluding each other. Each attribute is a way of describing substance, but no single attribute can capture the totality of substance. Spinoza tells us that we, as human beings, are capable of perceiving only two of these infinite attributes: extension, matter, and thought, mind. This limitation is due to our finite nature and limited cognitive capacity. It is not surprising for Spinoza that we can apprehend only these two attributes, as they directly correspond to our means of perception and reflection. The question of how Spinoza can assert that God, or nature, possesses an infinity of attributes, and that we can know only two of them rests on his definition of God as perfect and infinite. For Spinoza, it is logical that an infinite being possesses an infinity of attributes. Our ability to know only two of these attributes is simply a consequence of our finitude and our own constitution, which restricts us to extension and thought as primary modes of relation to the world. To make Spinoza's philosophy on substance, attributes, and modes clearer, I have prepared a small illustration, as sometimes an image can be more eloquent than a long discourse. Imagine a large circle representing substance, which, in Spinoza's metaphysics, is often symbolized by a circular figure to evoke the idea of totality. However, I have added around this circle a kind of halo for reasons I will explain later, giving our representation of substance an appearance similar to that of a sun. Inside this large circle, imagine several rays emanating from the center to the periphery. Each ray symbolizes an attribute of substance. For practical reasons, I have not depicted an infinity of rays, as this would transform our circle into a uniform disk, which would prevent us from distinguishing each attribute individually. So I have left space between each ray to clearly illustrate the distinction between them. In this illustration, I have specifically highlighted two main rays, which correspond to the two attributes that we, as human beings, are capable of perceiving according to Spinoza: extension, matter, and thought, mind. On each of these rays, I have drawn segments that act as bridges or bridges between the attributes, symbolizing interaction and interconnection between them. This illustrates how everything that exists in the world is a compound of several attributes. In Spinoza's philosophy, it is crucial to understand that the order and connection of things in the universe correspond exactly to the order and connection of ideas in our mind. This means that each material element or thought we have is directly linked to how these attributes articulate and interact in the total substance. This diagram aims to visually demonstrate how, in Spinoza's philosophy, everything is an expression of the unique substance, with an infinity of interconnected attributes, among which we can perceive only two. This limitation of our perception does not diminish the infinite reality of substance, but rather highlights the limits of our ability to understand the world in its entirety. Within the framework of his philosophy, Spinoza explores the relationship between the attributes of matter and thought, and he connects them through modes, which are concrete manifestations or expressions of these attributes. To illustrate this, imagine two parallel attributes and segments connecting these attributes, symbolizing modes. These modes are manifestations of substance, or God, composed of both matter and mind. This concept allows us to understand that we, as human beings, are combinations of these attributes. To make this idea more tangible, I used a visual representation. Think of a large circle symbolizing divine substance, which I surrounded with a halo to signify the dynamism and constant activity of substance, which is in opposition to the more static and immobile visions of God proposed by philosophers like Plato or Aristotle. Each ray of the circle represents a different attribute, and although we can perceive only two, matter and thought, Spinoza suggests that there are an infinite number of attributes. These attributes interact through what Spinoza calls modes, illustrated here by segments that connect the attributes of matter and thought. These modes are concrete examples of how the properties of substance manifest in the real world. Now let's talk about the dynamic aspect of divine substance. Spinoza introduces the concepts of natura naturans, nature as acting, producing, and natura naturata, nature as produced, created. Natura naturans is the aspect of nature or God that is active and productive, which begets, while natura naturata represents nature as the finite result of this production, the world in which we live, which is both constantly evolving and at the same time a finite product that accommodates us. To better understand, let's take the example of a child and its parents. The parents are the progenitors, and once grown, the child, natura naturata, can itself become a progenitor. We, as children of nature, are both products of this dynamic creation and participants in its continuous creative process. In this discussion of Spinoza, we explore the concepts of natura naturans and natura naturata to better understand the relationship between God and nature. These terms, which may seem abstract, describe how God, as an active principle, begets nature, and how this nature, once formed, continues to procreate in turn. One natura naturans, the begetting nature. This term refers to God in its active role, not as a voluntary creator with anthropomorphic intentions, but as an impersonal and dynamic force. God, or natura naturans, is the underlying principle that begets everything that exists without will or desire, simply by the expression of its intrinsic power. 2. Natura naturata, the begotten nature. This refers to everything produced by natura naturans, including the material world and everything it contains. It is the result of the activity of natura naturans, comparable to a child born of its parents. Just as the child grows up and can in turn generate life, natura naturata includes not only the physical nature, but also the continuous processes by which nature sustains and reproduces itself. Spinoza uses these concepts to emphasize that there is no sharp distinction between God and the world, nor between the Creator and its creation. Everything is a manifestation of the same divine substance. In this sense, saying God or nature implies complete identity between the two. God is not an external architect, but the total sum of all that exists, operating through immutable laws of nature. This perspective is often interpreted as materialistic, leading some to consider Spinoza as a precursor of modern atheism. However, this does not fully capture the nuance of his thought. For Spinoza, God or nature is an omnipresent and omnipotent entity, not in a traditional theistic sense, but as a fundamental and unavoidable reality that encompasses all that is. The assertion that we are God in the Spinozist context means that we are expressions of this divine substance. We are not separate from divinity, but integrated into its continuity, operating according to the same fundamental principles that govern the universe. This profound interconnection between God and creation, between mind and matter, is at the heart of Spinoza's philosophy and challenges traditional divisions between the sacred and the profane, the creator and the created. Spinoza did not simply claim to rename nature as God to avoid trouble. In reality, he did not publish some of his works during his lifetime precisely because he knew that simply associating God with nature would not suffice to avoid controversy. His approach is more nuanced and rests on the distinction of two aspects within the same substance: the active principle of begetting, which he names natura naturans, and the result of this begetting, natura naturata. For Spinoza, there is no real separation between these two modalities. They rather represent two states of the same entity. This is analogous to how a person can be both the child of their parents and the parent of their own children without contradiction. For Spinoza, God and nature are not distinct entities, but different expressions of a single substance. He advocates for a monism where the separation between body and mind is considered an artificial distinction that humans establish to better understand the world. This monist perspective rejects the idea of a duality between matter and mind, considering them rather as two aspects of the same continuum. Thus, reducing Spinoza to a mere materialistic atheism that crudely equates God with nature lacks depth. Spinoza rather argues that God is omnipresent not as an external creator, but as an immanent reality that manifests through everything that exists. According to Spinoza, we err in seeking God outside our world, for God is intrinsically present in everything, not as an external driving force, but as the very substance of which all existence is an expression. We, human beings, are manifestations of this divine substance, expressing and embodying God's attributes in our very existence. It is therefore crucial to understand that Spinoza did not advocate for simplistic materialism, but offered a deeply integrated vision of nature and divinity, which rejects traditional conceptions of God, while asserting an immanent sacredness to all that is. This perspective renders Spinoza's thought not only complex, but also profoundly revolutionary, challenging the fundamental distinctions upon which many theistic worldviews rest. Spinoza is not unanimously regarded as a materialist philosopher by commentators, as he transcends the divides between materialism and spiritualism. His doctrine insists that matter and mind are actually the same, simply viewed from two different perspectives. Thus, labeling Spinoza as a materialist while neglecting his discussions on the mind, or as a spiritualist while omitting his explanations of material nature, would be reductionist and erroneous. Spinoza's famous expression, God or nature, Deus sive natura, does not signify a mere equivalence between God and nature, but rather illustrates a shift in perspective on the unique substance that constitutes the universe. This formulation indicates that depending on the angle from which this substance is examined, it can be considered either as creative, natura naturans, or as creation, natura naturata. This perspective is essential for understanding that Spinoza does not separate the spiritual world from the material world. He sees them as two inseparable expressions of the same reality. Unlike traditional conceptions that isolate materialism from spiritualism, Spinoza presents a unified vision where matter and mind are intertwined and where any division is artificial. Regarding freedom and determinism in Spinoza, it is crucial to understand that for him, everything is subject to causality, which affects both physical objects and thoughts or ideas. The chain of thoughts, just like that of physical phenomena, follows the same laws of causality. This deterministic view of nature includes both the physical and spiritual aspects of existence, emphasizing that our understanding of freedom must be considered within this rigorously structured framework of causality. In Spinoza's work, the concept of free will is initially considered an illusion. However, Spinoza proposes that a form of relative freedom becomes accessible to man when he fully realizes the nature and origin of his actions. This means that understanding the external influences that affect our actions can free us from the chains of determinism, allowing us to act according to our own nature rather than under the impulse of external forces. Spinoza introduces a notion of freedom in God that differs radically from our usual conception of freedom. He uses the term free necessity, which may seem contradictory. For him, freedom is not the absence of determination, but the ability to be determined solely by oneself. In other words, to be free, according to Spinoza, is to act in accordance with one's own nature and not to be influenced by external factors. This idea of freedom is reflected in how we, human beings, must understand our own freedom. Spinoza suggests that following our nature does not mean yielding to our instincts in an animalistic way, but rather acting in accordance with our essence, which is guided by our intellect and conscience. It is crucial to grasp that for Spinoza, freedom does not consist of detaching from our nature, but rather of acting in harmony with it. This approach may seem paradoxical because it implies that our freedom lies in our ability to adhere to our own essence, which is a form of self-determination. Although Spinoza is often cited for denying the existence of free will, it is important to understand precisely what he means by freedom. Not total independence from influences, but a deep alignment with our own nature. This enlightens us to the fact that freedom, for Spinoza, is not an escape from our essence, but an authentic and conscious expression of it. It is essential to grasp that Spinoza defines freedom as the ability of a being to self-determine. that is, to define itself and act by itself. For Spinoza, this notion of freedom applies exemplarily to God or substance, as he considers it to be entirely self-sufficient, existing by the necessity of its nature and not influenced by external forces. In the beginning of his work, Ethics, Spinoza explains that a being is free if it exists solely by the necessity of its own nature. This approach differs radically from classical conceptions of freedom, such as those of Descartes, for whom freedom is perceived as a voluntary act of the soul, exempt from physical determinisms. In Spinoza's view, even the soul is not exempt from determinism, but freedom is understood as a free necessity. In Spinoza's philosophical vocabulary, necessity refers to the inevitable nature of a thing, its very essence that cannot be otherwise. Accepting this paradox is crucial to understanding that only God can be truly free. God is inherently what he is, without any separation between his potential and his action, which makes him a free being. Spinoza suggests that God does not question himself, not out of ignorance or inability to reflect, but because he is fully aware of what he is. This deep knowledge negates the need for questioning. When one knows exactly their nature and function, they act without hesitation. Moments spent doubting or questioning, according to Spinoza, are lost moments, distant from our true nature. For Spinoza, human freedom thus consists of fully realizing our nature and acting in accordance with it. Knowing our true nature, understanding our potential and limitations, is the path to a form of freedom where we can fully actualize ourselves. These concepts invite us to deep introspection. Understanding who we truly are and what we truly desire could lead us to authentic freedom, a freedom where we live in harmony with our essence, thereby becoming what we ought to be. Thank you.